Thank you for that, and good afternoon. This work of mine, I've been sort of dipping in and out of the Red Cross now for nearly on 20 years, and I've been running it out consistently for the last 2 or 3 years. It really interests me that, considering it is one of the world's largest not-for-profit relief organisations, that the amount of work from an academic point of view done on the International Red Cross and the Australian Red Cross is really very little. And in the First World War, there were a vast host of patriotic funds that were established, and there has been next to no work done on any of them. This work of mine and Melanie Oppenheimer's work on the National Red Cross from inception to recent times is quite rare. There are a host of other patriotic organisations that operated here in Sydney and across the country that raised what would be today millions of dollars or millions of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds from across the country, and next to nothing has been written about any of them, which really interests me. What's going on here? Whereas Australia is prepared to spend large amounts of money on celebrating the Anzac mythology, but this all goes with it. But anyway, it's a very interesting question. So my paper, The Red Cross and the Liverpool Field Hospital, Hope and Despair During 1915. The outbreak of war in August 1915 was met with jingoistic enthusiasm by the Australian population. Men volunteered in their hundreds for God, King and country to defend the empire, for adventure and to see the world. Women on the home front formed up the Red Cross and a host of other patriotic organisations in city and country to serve their boys. Unfortunately for the men who enlisted, their desire to serve the empire was not met with a similar level of organisational efficiency by authorities here in Australia, which is really disappointing when you think about it. The military were completely overwhelmed by the progress of the war, especially the level of casualties that resulted from the Gallipoli campaign. We didn't have a professional army in 1914, and it was sorely telling. On the spring of Tuesday morning, October 1915, the National President of the Red Cross, Lady Helen Munro Ferguson, and her husband, the Governor-General, Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, paid a visit to the Liverpool military camp southwest of Sydney. The visit topped off a year of intense activity for the Red Cross at the camp and the field hospital in particular. Red Cross workers had volunteered hundreds of hours of their time to support the war effort and their boys during the year in the face of very challenging conditions. The volunteers would encapsulate the allegory of the ministering angel, and I've written about that elsewhere, outlined for them by Lady Helen in July 1914 in an address she gave at St Mark's School about modern women in modern warfare. Lady Helen launched the Red Cross in Australia in August 1914 alongside a host of other patriotic organisations that I've mentioned. It was the Australian branch of the British Red Cross. Munro Ferguson, a capable and energetic organiser, ensured that the Red Cross put soldier welfare at the top of its priority. Her political influence and vice-regal position gave her a degree of influence that was unrivalled by any other organisation. The origins of the Red Cross are European, and they started off with Swiss businessman Henry Dunant when he wrote The Memory of Solferino in 1862. The British Red Cross, originally called the National Society for the Aid to the Sick and Wounded in War, was founded in 1870 after the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale was never present in the Red Cross in the 1870s. She was part of the Women's Committee, and the traditions that she established in the nursing profession are evident in the Red Cross as well. The British Red Cross provided service in the Turco-Serbian War, the Russo-Turkish War, the two South African conflicts as well. In 1908, it was adopted by Royal Charter. It formed up an organisation in 1909 called the Voluntary Aid detachment. Now, all the precedents set by the British Red Cross are evident in the First World War in Australia. Lady Helen set up a federation of state divisions in Australia with the governor's wives as the state or divisional presidents. The Red Cross very quickly and successfully filled a niche, providing comforts and hospital requisites for sick and wounded soldiers at a variety of hospitals across Australia, sanatoriums, and later on in the war, convalescent homes. The ever astute Lady Helen encouraged Australian women to see themselves as home front guardian angels through a network of local branches where effective fundraising in conjunction with divisional and national campaigns financed Red Cross welfare activities. In the opening months of the war, similar to the British Red Cross, they were supplying military camp hospitals in Australia and overseas with medical and surgical equipment, along with, surprisingly, soldiers' personal toiletries, hospital clothing, bed linen, ward furniture, and additional food items to supplement the diet. By October 1915, the New South Wales Red Cross had spent over £200,000, I don't know what that converts to in millions of dollars, but a lot of money, on medical equipment, ambulances, motor cars, food, comforts, clothing, and general hospital expenditure for military hospitals in Egypt, Lemnos, Malta, and England. While at home, the New South Wales Red Cross set up number 4 General Hospital at Randwick for 1,500 men, with another facility at Blackheath and field hospitals at Liverpool, Holsworthy, Warwick Farm, National Park, and Sydney Showground. There were local military hospitals at Newcastle, Goulburn, Armidale and Cootamundra, and they were supported by local Red Cross branches. The New South Wales Red Cross Produce Department, which is a reasonable guide to the sort of level of support, supplied camp and field hospitals in 23 locations across New South Wales, and 16 of those were in the Sydney area. The effort peaked in 1916 when local Red Cross branches were funding 7 military hospitals, 22 field and camp hospitals, and by 1918 the only one left was Liverpool Field Hospital. Now, much of this work was groundbreaking, as it was a first, and apart from the work of a number of small scholars, as I've mentioned, there's been no serious attempt to have a look at this. Now, if I move to the Liverpool Field Hospital, unfortunately there are no images of the field hospital that I've been able to find to date, so the views are of the camp in general. The Red Cross became involved with the Liverpool Field Hospital, which is a tented facility. This is typical of the Boer War as well, within days of its establishment in January 1915. The camp had been set up in October 1914. The infantry and light horse camps were about a mile apart on opposite sides of the railway line at Liverpool, if you know it. It's slightly south of the railway station. The infantry camp had 1,100 men by October 1914, with up to 250 recruits turning up daily from all over New South Wales. The men were accommodated in rows of tents, about 100 deep, with streets formed between them. The light horse camp was established with about 550 horses and men, and 50% of the horses were privately owned, and the camp had a shortage of about 150 horses in November 1914. I rather like this one. This is one of the earliest images that I've seen, November 1914. You can see on the left the recruits in the opening months of the camp. They had no uniforms, no weapons. The food was pretty terrible. The hospital wasn't there, and other issues as well. The light horse are out on the right, and there are a whole host of issues associated with the light horse encampment as well. They were short of supplies, horses. The men were told to bring their own gear, and a host of other issues. The progress of the war had overwhelmed the military authorities in late 1914. There were complaints from the soldiers in the Australian Worker, which is a left-leaning Labor Party newspaper of the day. It was reported that the commissariat arrangements were a disgrace. There was inadequate food, utensils, drinking containers, and one man stated that he had had 2 meals in 3 days. There was no money, they were not paid. By late 1914, shortages have got worse. There's all sorts of issues around lack of equipment and all sorts of things. The involvement of the Red Cross at the Field Hospital started in February 1915 when Mrs. Isabel Wallace Turner, the president of the Greenwich Red Cross, visited the camp. She was shown around the tents by Sergeant Major Lawrence. She reported that the small medical detail at the camp, which only had 2 small bell tents, was overwhelmed by an outbreak of influenza and inoculation illness. Wallace Turner, a businesswoman, had been busy from early in the year organising stay homes for troops needing convalescent from the Australian Naval and Military Expedition Force that captured German New Guinea. Wallace Turner was a prominent volunteer for patriot organisations in Greenwich and was a member of the Women's Reform League and the English Speaking Union. She reported that there were not enough stretchers at the field hospital. Some men were lying on the ground, and in her words, everything was in a muddle. She maintained that 6 soldiers at the field hospital did not have the necessaries to make them comfortable, with ill men lying in their clothes with rolled up overcoats for pillows. This type of response by the Red Cross at this stage of the war was typical of the Society's activities in various parts of the country, according to Red Cross archivist Moira Drew in Melbourne. In the Red Cross's formative stages, the priority was to respond to the need, and it was not uncommon for a group to go ahead with whatever task they saw the need for, with little central coordination. Wallace Turner's activities at Liverpool fitted this pattern, which was not dissimilar to hospital visiting undertaken by women who had been members of church committees and other organisations in the Boer War. Even in mid-1915, the policy that guided Red Cross activities in military hospitals stated that the Society responded to requests of the medical officers in charge of the unit to ensure effective treatment of wounded and sick soldiers. There were also other contributing factors to the poor state of the camp at Liverpool. One of them was the location of the camp on the lowest part of the floodplain, which meant that it became fog-bound. And Damper Bill, an old soldier, wrote to the Australian Worker stating that the site is wretched and too cold. And as a Queensland drover expressed it, cattle would not camp there. The military officers exposed new recruits who had been vaccinated and inoculated on enlistment to Spartan-like privations to, in their words, harden them up, which didn't help their health either. The third contributing reason was that there was just insufficient medical supplies. After Wallace's inspection of the camp medical facilities, the Greenwich Red Cross stepped in and supplied the field hospital with 50 pillows and 200 pillow slips. As the winter approached, more tents were erected and nearly 300 men needed attention. Wallace Turner claimed in the early days of the camp the men would not report to a doctor until they had become very ill because they feared going to the field hospital. She said the Red Cross got to work, organised the supply of a range of essential items. This started with pillows, pyjamas, dressing gowns, towels and washers, tents, enamel basins, and extended to soldiers' toiletries, cutlery, tin foodstuffs, fruit, cigarettes and tobacco. Facilities at the camp field hospital grew as the camp expanded, and by March 1915 there was an isolation hospital, a contact camp and a venereal disease compound. Further expansion in April occurred when a 10-bed cottage hospital was established for bronchopneumonia resulting from measles. Between January and April, the field hospital dealt with over 2,000 patients, roughly 500 a month. Cases range from malaria, diphtheria to appendicitis, with 6 deaths. The field hospital had a number of wards which varied between 10 and 12 beds per tent, with around 200 patients on any one day. Conditions at the Field Hospital started to look up by June, and there was the construction of the first galvanised iron and timber huts. And they accommodated 14-bed wards with 7 beds on either side of the ward. At the beginning of July 1915, politician Richard Beaumont Orchard MP, the federal Labor member for Nepean, which is the electorate the camp was located in, delivered a scathing attack on the mismanagement at the Liverpool camp in the Commonwealth Parliament in Melbourne. Orchard's electorate included the camp, and he became known as the champion of the interests of the ordinary soldier. His list of complaints included poor camp organisation, a lack of equipment, poor sanitary conditions, poor medical facilities, and an officious administration. There was an outcry in the Sydney and Melbourne press. The Salvation Army had a tent, but the YMCA, which are also active in the Second World War and in Britain as well as a welfare organisation for soldiers, have a presence. Meanwhile, the Red Cross carried on in the eye of the emerging storm. The Red Cross reported that the hospital facilities continued to be under tremendous strain, partly from the preventable situation of men becoming sick after enlistment. Consequently, there was an increasing demand for Red Cross comforts. Goods were supplied by Red Cross branches, Sydney Town Hall, Head Office and the Produce Department. Between February and July 1915, the Town Hall Centre supplied over 5,700 separate items to the Field Hospital, made up of pillow slips, pyjamas, shirts, mufflers, pillows, towels, washers, dressing gowns, mosquito nets and other items. Goods also included enamelware and foodstuffs, mattresses, hot water bags, slippers, surgical equipment, soap, clotheslines, hurricane lamps and cigarettes. Now, around the same time, the Red Cross was becoming interested in the recuperation of soldiers who had become ill, and they were amongst the first to establish convalescent facilities for sick soldiers, mainly from the New Guinea campaign, and the president of the Greenwich Red Cross was active in this as well. A few men were sent to Carrington Centennial Hospital at Camden and the Thomas Walker Convalescent Hospital at Concord West. This became, by the end of World War I, the largest activity of the Red Cross, and they had a considerable number of convalescent hospitals right across Australia. The Parramatta Red Cross became involved in trying to lift the level of care at the Field Hospital. In July 1915, Parramatta Red Cross workers started weekly visits and took responsibility for furnishing Ward A at the hospital. In August, the branch members sought donations of sheets and soap and supplied bed linen, toiletries, towels, foodstuffs, slippers and other personal items. By October, the branch had taken complete charge of the ward, fitted it out with furniture of various sorts and was supported by fundraising of the branch. In 1916, the men's branch of the Parramatta Red Cross supplied a host of furniture, and other Red Cross branches stepped up to look after the wards. Ashfield looked after C&D ward, Chatswood G ward, Lindfield F ward, Manly B hut, Randwick J ward, St James Church E and K ward, and there was additional support from Keira, Greenwich and Campbelltown Red Cross branches. During the year, the New South Wales Red Cross spent over £1,500 constructing a convalescent room at the camp and equipping the nurses' cottage and camp hospital. Support was also provided by other patriotic organisations, including the Auburn Women's Patriotic League in June and the Parramatta Liberal Institute. And you'll see from the slide that Mrs. Cook was the president of the Parramatta Red Cross at the outbreak of the war, and she's the wife of the Prime Minister of the time. By the end of 1918, she's Lady Cook and has quite a role to play. She goes off to England after the war in the 1920s and has a large family as well. And she's one of a number who take prominent roles in the Red Cross in New South Wales. Later on, In 1915, the Parramatta Red Cross workers were assisted by the young ladies of the Parramatta Voluntary Aid Detachment. The VAD was quite active in the convalescent homes. They provided volunteer labour, and not just at the Liverpool Field Hospital, but at various facilities right across New South Wales. The voluntary aides worked in the convalescent room 3 days a week and dispensed what was called extra comforts in the way of food, literature and lounges to the soldiers. The Parramatta VAD started in mid-1915 and had a membership of 60. It was modelled, as I mentioned, on the British VADs, which were formed up initially in the 1880s. Mr Orchard's attack in Parliament had quite an impact, and the stinging criticism resulted in the Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher, announcing a Royal Commission and appointing the Honourable Justice Rich to head the inquiry. Rich inspected the camp and then moved the commission to the site, where he took evidence from 118 witnesses over 2 weeks in July. Witnesses detailed inadequate troop training, obsolete rifles, sickness amongst new recruits, inadequate uniforms, particularly greatcoats, inadequate sanitary conditions. Architects and engineers confirmed the inadequacies of the buildings, of those that did exist, which were drafty, and evidence was given that the commanding officer would not issue the men with mattresses or straw because it would, quote, make the place untidy. Men and horses were insufficiently fed. There was poor discipline in the Army Medical Corps, and the patients at the camp hospital received poor treatment, and the commanding officer, Dr. Herbert Schlink, was only on duty in the afternoon so he could run his private practice in the morning in the city. The commanding officer of the German concentration camp next door, later known as the Liverpool internment camp, gave evidence to the inquiry that the prisoners were better clothed, better housed and better fed than army volunteers. In the early part of the inquiry, the medical administration of the camp could not even supply the commission with information on the number of sick men and their complaints. The medical authorities were only able to tell that there was a surprising number of cases of meningitis, while most sick soldiers complained of chest ailments. This situation was not surprising given the lack of medical records for this period of the war. Butler, who wrote the history of the Australian Army Medical Corps, complained of the lack of medical records as late as 1922. Commissioner Rich issued 2 interim reports and his final report in mid-August, which the Prime Minister initially refused to release. The Royal Commission vindicated all of Orchard's criticisms, although not allocating blame. In particular, the Commission reported that the conditions at the hospital left, quote, much to be desired. The supply of utensils, including bedpans, was, quote, totally inadequate, and the administration of the medical services, quote, clumsy and uncertain, with a shortage of staff, including doctors. Evidence was given on how medical orderlies were, quote, untrained, incompetent and inattentive. In response to the findings, the New South Wales branch of the British Medical Association established a site committee at the camp and investigated the 53 deaths of men in training at the camp up to that time. The Red Cross did not escape criticism either. There were scathing comments from Thomas Anderson Stewart, a member of the General Committee of the New South Wales Red Cross and Professor of Physiology at the University of Sydney. Anderson Stewart accused the Red Cross of misappropriation of funds for providing enamelware and furniture at the camp hospital that he maintained would have otherwise been provided by military authorities. The Red Cross was stung by the criticism, and in August, the businessman and politician James Ashton, who was a member of the Executive Committee of the New South Wales Red Cross, mounted a strident defence of the decisions of the Red Cross at the camp. He stated that enamelware was provided by a Red Cross volunteer at the camp through private fundraising, presumably Mrs Wallace Turner, to replace unhygienic plates and pannikins that were in use at the time. The society, Ashton claimed, was only interested in the well-being and health of the men. He did not agree with Anderson Stewart's view of the fundamental duty of the Red Cross. Ashton felt it was the Society's patriotic duty as expressed in the British Red Cross's aims to, quote, do everything it possibly can in reason towards the comfort and general well-being of sick and wounded men in the face of unprecedented demands that were, quote, beyond the expectation of anyone. Red Cross authorities were stoic in their defence and stated in the Sydney Press that there would always be critics and we must expect it. A Sydney Morning Herald journalist stated that he was glad that his Red Cross donation had been, quote, devoted to making a lot of our soldiers a little more comfortable than it might otherwise have been. The Red Cross took the high moral ground, supported by biblical references, and stridently defended its volunteers, who were the soldiers' mothers, wives and sisters. Red Cross authorities invoked the allegory of the Society as the soldier's mother and Red Cross workers as ministering angels, and I've written about that extensively elsewhere. These metaphors were used across the English-speaking world by the Red Cross during the First and later Second World War to garner community support. One Red Cross report stated, "This is a woman's work and no man could do it half as well, for it is a work not of the hand but of the heart." Wallace Turner was annoyed that there was criticism of the Red Cross at all, and she said they should take no notice. She maintained that Red Cross volunteers could see the reality of the situation, as she did, and shortages that existed at the field hospital. Wallace Turner, who had impeccable credentials as a Red Cross worker with 11 male relatives at the front, 4 who had been wounded, maintained that the men were better for Red Cross help. Lady Helen Munro Ferguson gave a rousing speech at the Sydney Town Hall in October 1915 and urged Red Cross workers not to be discouraged by any of the tales they heard. She maintained that if the men are fighting in the trenches, then it is the least we can do to support them. She stated, to much applause, that it is the dogged that does it, whether it is in the trenches or at home. She praised the efforts of the volunteers at the Liverpool Field Hospital and encouraged those present at the town hall to pay it a visit. She felt that it was perhaps one of the best field hospitals you can see anywhere. To further applause, she said the Red Cross supplied extra comforts, including quilts, extra linen, ice chests and linoleum, and seats outside the huts, as well as supplies for the nurses and the recreation hut. She emphasised that the whole nation is at war and everyone should make some contribution, and that was the answer to those who say that we are doing too many things that the government should do. She admitted mistakes had been made in Egypt earlier in the year, where the actions of the Red Cross had received much criticism, but stated that military authorities had been overwhelmed with the casualties from the Gallipoli campaign. Conditions at the Liverpool camp continued to improve in late 1915. The Wellington Recruiting Association in Western New South Wales passed a motion criticising the camp conditions, while the independent member for Macquarie, Thomas Thrower, made representations to the New South Wales Premier. By October, Mrs J.W. MacArthur Onslow, the wife of Colonel J.W. MacArthur Onslow, informed the commanding officer of the Liverpool camp that the Home Hospitals Committee of the New South Wales Red Cross had made satisfactory arrangements at the camp. The committee was led by Mrs McKinnon and included Mrs Laidley, Mrs MacArthur Onslow, Dr Bell and James Ashton, along with Mrs Turner from the Divisional Committee. The Home Hospital Committees in Melbourne and Sydney were initiated on the suggestion of the Acting Director of Medical Services in mid-1915. The purpose of the committees was to look after the special needs of the camp hospitals by establishing depots for the distribution of Red Cross goods. The depots had a permanent Red Cross officer in charge with a small women's committee to look after the entertainment of the sick and wounded. The New South Wales Red Cross had set up a home hospital comforts fund in June, and in November The New South Wales Home Hospital Committee felt that the Liverpool camp is not what it once was, with considerable improvements including a Red Cross recreation tent with tables and chairs for convalescing soldiers, staffed by voluntary aides from Parramatta, and a dispensary for medical staff. Red Cross workers provided a pleasant hospital environment for recovering soldiers, including dainty ward furnishings, pretty quilts and other bedclothes, the pyjamas the men wear, and even medicine chests. The homely environment at the field hospital was assisted by the provision of beautiful flowers. One noticed freshly picked waratahs and other wildflowers in the wards. Lady Helen visited in November 1915, and it was decided to replace the large recreation tent for convalescents with a permanent building. So what sort of conclusions can you come to? The work of the Red Cross at the Liverpool Field Hospital was an extension of the primary aim of the Society in Australia and its general soldier welfare activities throughout the First World War. The Red Cross was one of the first patriotic organisations of the Australian home front to identify gaps in the provision of medical and hospital facilities at the military camps. The Society stepped in and supplied Liverpool and other military camp hospitals with medical and surgical equipment and hospital supplies, as well as a range of personal soldiers' requisites and comforts, as many Red Cross workers had previously done in other capacities during the Boer War. When Lady Helen Munro Ferguson set up the Red Cross in August 1914 as a branch of the British Red Cross, she took her lead from the precedents set by the British organisation. Lady Helen encouraged thousands of women to see themselves as ministering angels who cared for their boys by supplying hospital comforts and requisites, supported by fundraising efforts through a large and extensive branch network and divisional structures. The Red Cross was seen by many in New South Wales in the First World War as the metaphorical soldier's mother looking after the interests at home and abroad. The Red Cross effort at Liverpool was led by Greenwich Red Cross President Wallace Turner and tried to ameliorate the situation by supplying hospital requisites and soldier comforts. The atrocious conditions at their camp were raised in federal parliament and a royal commission was called. The findings were scathing and the Red Cross did not escape criticism. Red Cross authorities staunchly defended the actions of volunteers, encouraging women to remain stoic and do their patriotic bit. More than anything, the Red Cross and its services provided reflected the poor planning, under-resourcing and poor judgment of the military medical authorities at the Liverpool camp in the first year of the war. The contribution of the Red Cross was a form of voluntary taxation that supported the government in the war effort, which was not immediately appreciated or understood. The Red Cross had to justify its actions and the fundraising necessary to support this soldier welfare to the wider community. The role of the Red Cross was rarely acknowledged during the war, and even today, recognition of its wartime home front is largely still silent. Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. So have we got some questions?
Yeah, I've got an old photograph at home. My family came from Parramatta, and there's a series of ladies all dressed in white outside a stall, which I assume is fundraising for the First World War. So I'll scan it and send it to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I would be quite confident in saying that they were the Red Cross. Most of the women at fundraising activities wore a white uniform,
white uniform,
which is similar to the postcard in the opening slide.
Yeah. There's another one. My great uncle was Parramatta's first war hero, and it looks like there's a photograph there of the official welcoming dinner back from the Anzac Cove. So I'll scan that for you. It's in a long term. Okay.
Something which is supplementary to the paper is the history of the Australian Army Medical Corps, which was written up after the First World War. in excess of 200,000 individual medical records were destroyed in Europe because they were seen of no value. The Red Cross did not write up its history, although it was requested to do so by military authorities, as being wrote up the history of the First World War in the 1920s. And no history of their First World War effort has ever been written. They dedicated the history of their effort in the First World War.
It always intrigued me. My grandfather, on Christmas Eve, when the Salvation Army came around, they used to have a band and they'd knock on every door, and he gave them 10 shillings, which was a considerable amount of money, 1947, 48, probably earlier. But I found out later from one of his colleagues was that the Salvation Army was right up there in the front, in the trenches, and if you did, the soldiers, tobacco and chocolate and stuff like that, if you didn't have the money, they gave it to the soldiers. And knowing my grandfather, he probably gambled it all, but that was his way of saying thank you. He always gave them 10 shillings on Christmas Eve. He wasn't very religious, I might add.
You've got a question?
Yeah, well, first of all, comment. I have a friend whose father was in the First World War, and he also recalls how grateful his father was towards the Salvation Army. Even again, he wasn't religious, but he always donated because he valued what they provided. It was the one big relief from home. The question I want to ask is, what did this Red Cross provide? I'm not clear in my mind as far as nursing care went.
The Red Cross Society themselves didn't provide nursing care. They provided supplies. The women, not just the branches, but the state division here in Sydney, down in Clarence Street, fundraised extensively to purchase supplies of one sort or another, wherever they saw the gaps. The voluntary aid detachments, which are affiliated with the Red Cross and St John's Ambulance, with British origins, those women volunteered in all sorts of facilities, field hospitals in Australia and in Europe, and just behind the front line to supplement nursing care. They did a lot of the work that the professional nurses were not able to do. They served extensively in Australia and England and in France. These are Australian VAs, but you also have English VAs as well, serving. Voluntary aid detachments were served in the Second World War as well, and they also volunteer at the convalescent hospitals. The one I mentioned, Parramatta Voluntary Aids, but out in the southwest there was a convalescent home out of Picton, and the local VAs affiliated with the local Red Cross branches volunteered their services. And it's interesting that most of the Red Cross hospitals and convalescent homes are donated by wealthy families in Sydney and Melbourne, at a time when the role of the federal government in this field, if you like, was non-existent. The Australian Army military nurses had been in action from the time of the Boer War, so you have military nurses. The TV show Anzac Girls demonstrates what they were up to. But as far as these convalescent homes are concerned, they're generally staffed by orderlies, female orderlies or male orderlies, and VAs.
I remember you saying, like in the early days of the war and the camp, up until August 1915, that several people had died. There were 53, but you also said that there was a big outbreak of meningitis. Why would this be the case? You know, these are fit young men. These are not ones that have come back from anywhere, are they?
Now, I'm no medical expert and my medical knowledge is quite limited, but the recruits were given an inoculation. Some of them became quite ill, and because of the location of the camp, the physical location of the camp on the flat immediately adjacent to the river, which became, in the winter months in particular, were quite cold. The men are sleeping on the ground in a lot of cases. In the field hospital, as it was called, there were no cots in the early opening part of the months of the camp. The men become ill, and we forget quite quickly that diseases like measles and so on are quite, and surprised me, malaria, for instance, they're not uncommon. But I would think that the meningitis is a complication. Some of the men died from pneumonia, are a complication of that. And the medical officers at the field hospital gave reports, which are in the Sydney Press, of the poor conditions based around the inoculation and the men becoming ill because of the contributing factor, the location of the camp itself. They eventually, by the end of 1915, they relocate the camp to another bench of the river on the flat further east to where it currently is now, where the Holsworthy camp is. So they eventually had Holsworthy military camp and Liverpool military camp, but closer to where Holsworthy camp is, which is quite away from the river now. But in the opening months of the war, it was on, if you know Liverpool, the railway station and the Georges River, they're next to each other, and the bench of the river flat immediately adjacent on the eastern side of the river is quite low, and you rise probably 500 metres to the east, it rises again and then again further out, and they moved the camp further away. The hospital's moved by, I think, mid-1915 to higher ground. The conditions of the camp, I mean, those quotes from those fellas are quite scathing. I mean, we're talking about fellas who are used to bush camps, drovers camps. I mean, the slides that I've shown, some of those facilities, the drovers camps would have been more hygienic. The reports of the fog and the frost in the cooler months of 1915 apparently are contributing to the ill health of men which are suffering because of their inoculation. These are men that are then going away. So they're volunteered, they're coming. Liverpool is just a reassignment sort of coordination camp, if you like, and Broadmeadows in Melbourne is the Victorian equivalent. And Liverpool camp, they unit up, they make up the unit, and then they move them on. I don't know how long the units stay. You need to read the unit diaries, but they process thousands of men. And the reports that you read in the Sydney Press, certainly in the early months of 1915, they had up to 200 men a day turning up Liverpool railway station. They just couldn't, they couldn't cope, 200 men a day, on top of what was going on. And then in mid-1915, they start to get their act together based on the criticism and so on. But you also get the casualties coming back from Gallipoli to Australia, I think, by late May 1915. And that only makes the situation worse.
What you're describing is like the Crimea. And I'm wondering what happened in the years in between, what happened to training and what happened to the forward-thinking army? Did something go wrong just with the psyche of the people involved?
You've got to remember that Australia did not have a professional army in 1914. We had a part-time militia, and that part-time militia is based on British experience. Kitchener, I haven't shown the slides here, but there are quite extensive images of Kitchener at Liverpool on the same site in 1910, where he has a whole host of recommendations about what the Australian government should do for an Australian military. And one of those things that they do is to purchase the Liverpool site for a military camp. So they own the site, and one of the cottages on the farm turns out to be where they accommodated one of the wards of the field hospital, and it was staffed by the army nurses. I think they had 3 nurses in the cottage. I think by mid-1915.
There must be a name for it, and I can't think of it. A list of the virtues they uphold, like justice, truth, you know what I mean, a list. Have you got a list of that? I did see it one time.
Yes, I've written about exactly what you've asked. There's a paper on the Independent Scholars Association website. There's a paper coming out that I presented at their conference last year, which is across this theme. There's also a Canadian Red Cross researcher, but she's written across the same sort of material. There's also the article in History magazine last year, which I would point to, that was the opening slide, and other sources as well.
Oh, it's just an interest of the internment camp. I was just curious to see what was done there, and I suppose it would be a much less number of people, but who was working in the internment camp in comparison to what was being offered to Australians?
The internment, or the German concentration camp, as it was called at the opening days of the war, and they changed the name fairly smartly. I don't know the size of the camp, but they were Australian Germans, first generation, second generation that were interned, and also Eastern Europeans. I would recommend that you have a look at the Liverpool Museum website. They had quite a large exhibition 5 years ago, and what happened at Liverpool or Holsworthy is not the worst of it. Torrens Island in South Australia is the worst of it. Highly recommend that you have a look at it. The conditions that Australian-born fellas of German extraction were treated abysmally. The soldiers at Torrens Island were the rejects from the army, and they took it out on the internees.
If you're interested in information about the ones who were interned, National Archives, you can actually do a search on internment. You'll get a list of all the ones, and lots of them were the children of those who had come as assisted immigrants in the 1850s.
There's quite a story there. John McQuilton has written about internees in Victoria. It was not uncommon for someone to complain to the authorities about a competitor in business who happened to be of German extraction, and they would be interned in Victoria, put them out of business. There are also reports of fellas being interned and members of the country town going out trying to get them out. There is no consistency in the story. It differs by camp, it differs by state, and by individual in a lot of cases. There's no consistency, and I encourage you to have a look at the South Australian story in particular, because it's quite depressing.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, if there are, please join me in thanking you.
And if anyone wants to read the full paper, it's being published shortly. The paper has been peer-reviewed and will be published in a medical history journal called Health and History, published out of the University of Sydney shortly.